Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are Adventuresome Reviews, reviewing
We the 100 by Nathan Timmel, I think. Yes, Timmel. A book of daring criminals and heroic FBI agents hunting down one another in a non-stop chase to the death. All of which was completely fabricated. But...
Okay then, let's give them the real synopsis then. And no more shenanigans out of you.
After losing his wife, Evan Francart is depressed. He has an axe to grind with a pharmaceutical company that jacked up the price of her medications, but feels powerless against a billion-dollar corporation. Then he meets Cassandra. She shows Evan a way to both end his life and become a hero. With her guidance, Evan interrupts a company board meeting and blows the building sky high. Poof!
Poof.
As FBI agents Susan Chamberlain and Michael Goodwin discover, Evan is the first of many, 99 more like him, waiting anonymously in the wings. Their targets just as personal as Evan's. The prosecutor who lets a rapist walk free. The inept surgeon who maims patients yet keeps operating. The phony evangelist preying on those seeking solace. And that's just the beginning. Will the FBI unearth Cassandra's identity before all 100 have carried out their diabolical plans? I threw the diabolical because I like the word. There you go.
So first off, I really like the overall plot setup for this book. The idea was really interesting and well executed from all the various perspectives. And most of the time, the motivations were really, for the...
suicidal bombers, what have you.
Were really effectively implemented and displayed and shared.
Right. So, in another book, what the author did probably would not have worked, right? Because every couple chapters he would introduce a new character that commits the crime, kills a bunch of people, not a bunch, but kills their target, and then commits suicide shortly thereafter. And at the start of each of these chapters, you would get a bit of a backstory, a half a chapter of backstory that would typically dramatically slow down the book, make it just boring to read, because you're obviously introducing new characters every third chapter, and you're delving into the backstory on characters you don't really have an emotional attachment to. But because of how the story is written, this becomes necessary and intriguing, and the author did a good job of landing.
But it's also part of it is that the author doesn't just give you a block of text. No, he feeds you the story in the midst of he feeds you the backstory as the actual story progresses. So it's not just block of text at the start of chapter, then the story begins.
Right. And so a lot of the times, or a couple of times, the criminal in question was setting up for their plan, right? And as this was going on, they were thinking about their past, and the author was explaining what was going on in a very, handy way, and it a lot of the times made for one, it actually gave the criminal's personality, but it was also made the backstory engaging to read.
Yeah. And all the individual, there's not really a good word for it, but all the individual murder scenes were well executed as well. They were tense, because you often knew something was going down. So there was both the interplay of, will this character succeed in his murder attempt, interplayed against the constant knowledge that this is illegal and full-on murder, emotionally justified or not. And so that's part of what made me really enjoy the concept, is the moral interplay constantly evolving, and
it's something the book leaned into heavily. It's a question that constantly came up, even to the point where even the main characters debate it amongst themselves of whether what these activists, these vigilantes, are doing is morally justified or just cannot be allowed.
Yeah.
One of the things I slightly disliked about the book is that it did not come up with an answer. Like
That didn't bother me because it kind of did in a way because of the conclusion. But the way the book concludes delivers the answer. Maybe there was no way you could really conclude the book just because other way you could conclude the book because of how of the shape of the narrative and the story, and you have the characters on the opposing side, so it had to reach some conclusion, and the conclusion itself is
I don't know.
because it's also just
it's complicated and difficult to explain because obviously it's a moral quandary and those are difficult to come up with quick answers for. In short, I felt the lack of an answer on one way or the other. The book didn't decide. I felt,
but it's not the book's. The author can't tell you what's correct. The book didn't really get into enough of the nitty-gritties. It was a book that presented the situation to you and spent a little time exploring the situation, but the book was not about finding the answer to the question. That it was more of presenting the question to the readers, and the readers getting to enjoy the inherent conflict in that question.
I guess.
Something that I didn't particularly like about the book, or rather, is that the first couple of chapters, the exposition did not land as well. Like, the first chapter is an excellent tension scene setting, which is where Evan Frankart commits his murders and blows up the
pharmaceutical
company board.
But immediately after you get into the backstories of our main characters.
And
this works significantly less well because they're not capped off by the giant explosion and the moral quandary of the vigilantes.
And also, to some extent, almost all three of these initial characters are not given personalities, per se. Their personality is conveyed via political opinions, which results in it reading like a checklist of the author's opinions slightly.
Yeah, the book did feel political.
Well, that didn't bother me. Like, yes, the book's political, but that's because it's a political topic.
I guess, but so one thing, this is dangerous because the author referenced political events routinely throughout the book. But if you are not somebody who is paying attention or has been paying attention to the past 8 years of the elections and the politics and the news, a lot of this is going to fly over your head because and most people are not that interested in politics where they watch it every day. So this is kind of a bad thing to politics and kind of political events are a bad thing to use for similes.
I don't know. It was only the first 3 chapters that just struck me as poorly handled from the political standpoint. And it's almost exclusively just because it was the politics it was using the politics to describe the characters, which is awkward. Like, the politics in the rest of the book, that was fine. That was well handled. And it wasn't like, it didn't come across as preachy, which is often what happens when you have like a really strong political bent in a book. And it didn't because
there's
and I think it's because the main antagonist was really well handled.
Yes.
His motivations, his conflicts, his politics.
He
had the most depth of any character in the book.
He was actually almost apolitical. Because he was not angry at a particular establishment or law or anything like that. He was angry at not the degradation, but the degradation of society and how he saw society spinning off into just violence and greed and basically all those other things that he was trying to galvanize the people in order to punish those the law would not. The untouchable few.
Yeah. And it just, I really enjoyed his chapters, and it just, again, the moral complexity and really well-structured character. Especially since your two main FBI characters were several times worse. They had almost zero personality. They were vehicles for the narrative.
Their personality amounted... Agent Chamberlain was a competent woman, right? That was her personality, kind of, right? And maybe a little bit by the book, or not even to the extent where it clashed with other people. She was simply crossed her T's and dotted her I's.
Yes.
Goodwin was slightly better because he had ideas, right? And he occasionally resolved problems. And the author gave him like this little catchphrase a little bit. But still, by and large, they were kind of boring.
Yeah.
Their boss, however, I kind of liked.
Yeah, I was just remembering that I kind of did like their boss because, if only because he's given more meat, like narrative meat to deal with, like balancing the publicity of the situation with managing expectations, managing his crew, managing threat, just...
And his character type is that of somebody who doesn't really like dealing with the public, who is a straight shooter and very curt, but not rude curt. He simply is to the point, but also incredibly fair.
Yes.
Right? There comes this one scene, it's like my favorite scene from him. He has them, all right, make your case. And they make their case, and he says, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, and points out all the ways they goofed up. And he says, all right, go do it again, bring it back to me, right? And then I might send you to where you want to go, right? Yeah. Except the moment they leave the room, he's already buying the tickets because he thinks they actually have a good idea. So he trusts his people, but he's making them do their work. And that was a really nice balance for the character.
Yeah.
So he come across as a really nice boss. So another low-key problem I had, it's a problem where the villain was too competent and the hero's too incompetent. And that's setting it really hard, and to some extent it kind of feels like the author did this intentionally, but our protagonists were never allowed to resolve a situation. Every advancement they made was initially because one of the vigilantes didn't go through, he chickened out, what have you.
Yeah.
Right? And so they got a big lead off that they then followed up on and then hit a dead wall, right? Or not quite, but it's like they had to be given if the story wanted to progress, the author had to give them something via mistake on that of the villain or the protagonist or the vigilantes. And so it made it slightly difficult to actually... It felt like the good guys were just waiting around for a tip to come in.
That did not bother me. Like, an element of that concept bothered me slightly, but because that's how police work works. The criminal, they have to make a mistake. And that's how the police, and that's how you further the crime, or you connect ends. And the only reason it felt wrong is because your main antagonist was so competent. So that when he did make mistakes, because he made one mistake, this is what bothered me, it was such a dumb mistake. I'm like, you're too intelligent for this. It was a cheap mistake to further the plot. It was a mistake the character had no right to make in believability. But like the person chickening out, that was a perfectly believable and, in my opinion, an organic way to progress the plot, to give them the clue and allow them to continue forward.
Yeah. So it's like they themselves only found one lead, right? That was not either the villain making a mistake or a vigilante chickening out, right? And there was like 4 or 5. They had like 4 or 5 kind of leads given to them throughout the book, right? And the one they did find was marginally clever, right? It's Goodwin actually doing his job and following his ends and noticing a slight just irregularity, right? And so that was good. It's just it makes for a very realistic book, but also just slightly. Really, could you guys be a little bit smarter?
Yeah, it didn't bother me, so it's probably just going to be whether dependent on how flashy of a main protagonist you want. And I just, yeah. I think if the protagonist had more personality, it wouldn't nearly have bothered you as much.
Probably.
I think that's more or less all the thoughts I had about the book.
Me too.
It's not a long book, and the meat of it is the moral quandary, so there's not a whole lot.
Problem is that the main characters are the main characters, and they take a lot of screen time in the book, which can. And so if you want to read this book, you are going to read it entirely for the
Thematic plot
right.
and the antagonist, and for me that justifies reading the book. I would have given the book 4 stars. I very much enjoyed it.
So for me, I'm gonna give it a 2 star. I'm gonna rate it twice. The book itself, all its parts, 3.5. The main plot of the book, including the villain and the moral quandaries, 4.5, right?
Yeah. Well then, that's it for us. Toodaloos.
Goodbye. Fare thee well, our future friends.